Hello and welcome to the latest edition of Rad TV UK. I'm Ian Henschel. For this programme we've got British austerity, Iraqi death squads, an update on the North Korean reports, panic some people would say, drone killings and how it's spreading from America outwards, a roundup of the latest on Fukushima, the Fukushima disaster. We've got two pieces of good news, and we're going to start with Clive Menzies, who's going to tell us about the changes to the NHS, the National Health Service in the UK. Clive.
Good evening, Ian. Well, first a little context is required. This is basically implementation of the shock doctrine, which was developed by the Chicago Business School and was trialled out in South America, most conspicuously under Pinochet in Chile, where it had to be enforced with brutal severity, and we know the consequences of that. It was then rolled out further across Poland, South Africa, Russia, for example, and it's been applied in a very mild form hitherto in the UK. Thatcher actually said to Pinochet, we could never do this over here, but it's actually now being done in the UK, and the NHS is a prime target in sight at the moment.
I noticed these revelations in the Telegraph that 1,000 GPs have been legally restrained from disclosing what's going on in local health welfare commissioning, and that, you know, people are saying, well, what have they got to, why do they want to keep this secret? It's extraordinary, isn't it?
Well, I think there's a complex picture behind that, and I think one first has to understand the reason why they're being gagged. They are being tied in under confidentiality contracts so that they can't actually disclose details of the commissioning, which could actually lead to the sort of things that we see where in any organisation where there is secrecy and large amounts of money, the opportunity for criminality and corruption is rife. And so clearly the lack of transparency is extremely worrying. And if we look at the progression of the privatisation of the health service, pre-Thatcher management expenses were about 3% of the total budget. In 2010, a report which had been compiled 5 years earlier by York University actually revealed that 14% was going on management now.
So management costs have gone up under the Thatcherite sort of plans from 3% to 14% of our tax money.
By successive governments, and by 2005 it was 14%. I don't think one would be stretching credibility to suggest it's probably gone further now. And if we look at the way privatisation is being conducted, it's to allow American-type healthcare to be imported to Britain. Now, according to the World Bank in 2010, the UK spent 9.6% of its GDP on healthcare. In contrast, the US spends 17.9%, and yet millions don't have access to adequate healthcare. The healthcare providers act as gatekeepers to the service and basically deny access to healthcare on the grounds of the small print within the insurance contracts.
So we're headed on a trajectory which is going to double the percentage of GDP that we spend on healthcare, and we may not even get any better healthcare. It might even be worse.
That's quite possibly true, and one of the mechanisms for making sure this happens are free trade agreements, which are very poorly understood by most people. Free trade agreements are negotiated in secret. Very seldom do governments, or not governments, very seldom do politicians have access to the details, but the corporate advisors who are beneficiaries of these agreements are actually involved in the negotiation. So, for example, there are congressmen who said they've not seen detail of these negotiations, and yet they're implemented, and once they're implemented, they basically overrule national sovereignty. And yes, it could open us up to the American experience of healthcare, which is great for those at the top of the wealth scale, but not very good for those at the bottom.
And there was a movement against this, the anti-globalisation movement. It's still there in a sense, but it was eclipsed by the 9/11 attacks, really, and the war, the decade of wars. and so many people shifted to the anti-war movement that we all forgot about this ongoing process of privatisation and financialisation of our essential services.
Indeed. And there was a new scientist study published in the autumn of 2011 which actually looked at public records. It didn't attempt to look behind the shareholders register or the directors, but just looked at public record, and it found that it was looking at 40,060 transnational corporations, so basically most of the companies that run the world, and they found that there were 147 what they described as super entities, which controlled 40% of this network. And of the top 50, 45 of those are financial companies. And I think if you look behind the blind trusts and the nominee companies, you'd probably find that the power is constrained even further in fewer hands.
So there really is a sort of octopus, and nobody really knows what's going on inside that octopus because it's all covered by confidentiality, business secrecy.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's corrupting, as evidenced by these confidentiality clauses. It's corrupting government, it's corrupting public institutions, it's corrupting the media, certainly, because we're not hearing about this. And it taints every aspects of our lives.
Clive Menzies, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
This month, the Condemned government unleash another wave of austerity measures. Our correspondent, Fran Anderson, has been looking into this. Fran, what can you tell us?
Well, basically, Ian, the 1st of April 2013 is going to go down in British history as the worst time of a tax on the poor since Victorian times. The 1st of April, the bedroom tax came in, effectively fining people on benefits in social housing for having a spare room, and yet MPs that have publicly funded residences with spare rooms are not being fined for their spare room. Also on the 1st of April 2013, more people are having to pay something towards their council tax, whereas before they were completely exempt. So that's causing more poverty. And also on the 1st of April, the working tax credits are being substantially reduced. So people who are in work but having to claim the working tax credit because their wages aren't very high are going to be affected. And also on the 1st of April 2013, a lot of the legal aid is being withdrawn from a whole list of cases, including those that are challenging their benefit decisions.
So people who were already on pretty much subsistence level are having a series of extra charges and cuts. People in work who needed extra money are having that taken away. I don't know who's going to replace that. They're in work, they're not shirkers in any sense. What are people saying about this in the political world?
Well, Britain's most senior judge, Lord Newberger, said that withdrawing legal aid will undermine the rule of law. The Bar Council have produced a guide for litigants in person because people are going to have to represent themselves. And Michael Meacher has written a very good article attacking the whole ideology behind the welfare cuts and the austerity cuts in the Morning Star, April the 7th edition.
And Osborne doesn't practice what he preaches. You were saying that the MPs, they get paid, but nobody takes off any money from their pay, their allowance for housing allowance. Nobody takes anything off that if they've got a house at home that they're renting out because they're not living in it. That's just extra money for them.
Yes, well, basically, Osborne's budget has
given... That's George Osborne, the Chancellor, yeah.
George Osborne's budget has, quoting Jeremy Corbyn MP here, has given every multi-millionaire in Britain a tax cut, giving them about £100,000 more per year. So that's being paid for by the poor, by cuts on the poor.
Right. And I think you were telling me that Osborne has a house of his own in Notting Hill?
That's right, yes. Osborne, let's remember that he was parking a disabled bay illegally. He's been travelling first class with a second class ticket on a train, and he's totally unconcerned about the effects that all these cuts are going to have. And he's expecting people to work more hours for less income, and he even wants to lower the minimum wage, which is low enough already. And he rents out this 5-storey house in Notting Hill, as you mentioned, which is worth £3 million. Whilst at the same time benefiting from his taxpayer-funded 11 Downing Street and Dorney residences.
It's got 2 free residents paid for by the taxpayer, and then his normal five-story, I thought I was going to say 5 bedrooms, probably more than 5 bedrooms, 5-story house in Notting Hill, he rents that out and cops all the money for it.
That's right.
Fascinating. So what can people do? You know, presumably there are people campaigning against this.
Yes, well, there are many campaign groups set up, like Disabled People Against the Cuts, UK Uncut, and basically there's a People's Assembly on June the 22nd at Central Hall, Westminster. So it's very important that people join a network that's striving for a more equal society, because at the moment we've got the mainstream media and the government hand in hand demonising the poor and benefit claimants for the financial crisis, which in actual fact was caused by the bankers.
Yeah. So the whole austerity theory is very controversial, and most people would say that it's a load of rubbish. That the last thing we need is austerity in the middle of a recession. Even the Keynesian, even the mainstream Keynesian economists agree with that, let alone the more radical people who feel that it's due to money creation. We're sort of being strangled by the banks. They're cutting off the money supply, driving us into recession, claiming that then we need to cut government spending and then hitting the poor rather than the rich. That's the allegation anyway.
It's welfare for the rich, basically.
Welfare for the rich. So the People's Assembly, we're tipping. Are we tipping the People's Assembly as as one of the big campaign groups opposing this?
Well, a lot of all the other groups like Disabled People Against the Cuts, UK Uncut, and Coalition Against Poverty, they're all going to go to this meeting. So it seems to be a call out for everybody that's concerned about doing something about gathering up a network to do something about the cuts.
Fran Anderson, thanks very much.
Thank you, Ian.
New evidence from the mainstream media shows that the US set up death squads in Iraq as part of their struggle to subdue the insurgency there. Our correspondent Fran Anderson has been having a look at this. Fran, what did you find?
Well, Ian, The Guardian and BBC Arabia have made a documentary last month sparked by classified US military logs that were released on WikiLeaks thanks to Bradley Manning. And these leaks showed how the US backed and armed death squads in Iraq to create conflict between the Shias and the Sunnis. So it's using a divide and rule tactic.
So that's the Guardian, the BBC. What everybody suspected at the time, the so-called Iraqi civil war was aided and abetted by the Americans to maintain their occupation of Iraq. And are there any? I hear that there's a guy who's alleged. I think we'd have to say alleged rather than knowing with 100% certain. But there does seem to be an American military figure who's associated with this sort of practice.
That's right. Well, Donald Rumsfeld apparently nominated Colonel James Steele to help set up the Iraqi death squads. And this Colonel Steele was part of the US military assistance to the El Salvadorian Army's death squads back in the 1980s.
This is the allegation.
Yes, and also it's alleged that he was also involved in the Iran-Contra affair. So the US set up sectarian Shia paramilitaries called the Wolf Brigade or the Badr Brigade, who then targeted Sunnis to torture and murder. And the UK has also got its hands dirty.
Yes, there's a British angle to this as well, isn't there?
Yes, they also backed the Badr Brigade. And let's remember that the 19th of September 2005, 2 men dressed as Arabs with bombs driving a booby-trapped car opened fire, killing an Iraqi policeman. They were arrested by Iraqi police. They were initially reported by the mainstream press as being Shia terrorists, but it turned out that they were actually 2 British SAS men.
I remember that. It was one of the very rare occasions when this sort of false flag terrorism makes it into the mainstream media. And the British smashed down an Iraqi police station to grab them, didn't they? They weren't prepared to let the Iraqis put them on trial. They just went, I think they sent a tank in and smashed down the Iraqi police station. That was really, in a way, a lot of people thought that was the beginning of the end of the occupation of Iraq, because it had become so transparent what they were up to. And then there was the TV as well. They tried to rig the TV, the media that they set up there.
Yes, after the invasion of Iraq, the US wanted Iraqi TV to become a propaganda machine for the occupation. So two British companies, Chiltern Broadcast Management, run by a UK colonel, formerly with British Army Psychological Operations, who operated in Northern Ireland, targeting the nationalist community. And you had Albany Associates, run by a former British Royal Marine, Simon Hazelock, who was interviewed by the BBC recently. These two people were brought in to advise how to run Iraqi TV, and yet they've got no media experience. So in 2005, Iraqi TV broadcast a reality TV show showing live on TV torture of so-called terrorists who were in obvious pain and distress, confessing to hideous murders and having gay orgies in mosques.
Gay orgies in mosques, that sounds like something that was made up in Hollywood, doesn't it? It's how preposterous. And yet, if you tell people things with the authority of a TV network, some people will believe it.
Yes, and General Petraeus apparently objected to the torture being aired on TV, so he knew about the torture, but he, like many other US top military people, did nothing to stop it, although he claims he doesn't support torture.
And it's only thanks to WikiLeaks that we know about this anyway. So it's all about keeping things secret and just the occasional bit of truth coming out into the corporate media, and then they quite often forget it the next day when they come to write the next day's news bulletins. Fran Anderson, thank you very much. The so-called North Korean crisis, who is a threat to who? Is it really North Korea threatening South Korea, or do North Korea feel threatened by massive manoeuvres that are going on there, organised by America and South Korea? Roy Hunter, you've been looking into this, and you've been looking at the history of the Korean Peninsula.
Yeah, we have to put this into perspective, really. The Korean War, which started in 1950, lasted for 3 years. That was only 5 years after the US dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, of course.
Dropped the atom bomb.
Dropped the atom bomb.
US drops atom bomb on Hiroshima. 5 years later, Korean War breaks out.
That's right. So you can imagine the Koreans are terrified, really, with that little bit of history behind them, only 5 years behind them. And what happened was there's estimates that the North Koreans lost up to a third of their population.
So they didn't drop the atom bomb on North Korea.
No, this was
just with conventional.
Well, conventional napalm and incendiaries, yeah. But so out of a population of 8 or 9 million, there's an estimate that 2 million died.
And how do we know that? Is there any
well,
from the American side?
Yeah, General Curtis E. LeMay said over a period of 3 years or so, we have killed off, 20% of the population? So he's admitting to killing off 20% of the population, and many other estimates put it higher than that, really.
Extraordinary. And now, according to the official story, North Korea is somehow provoking South Korea and America.
Yeah, but what's really happening? I mean, the Americans and South Koreans are doing joint exercises, which have been lasting for 2 months. They've been using live firing. They've been dropping dummy bombs on disputed islands and things like this. And we've also seen the US bring in B-52s and nuclear-capable B-2 stealth bombers, and they've been flying those over the peninsula, not over enemy territory, but over the peninsula.
So if anybody is provoking anybody, you could just easily say it was the South Koreans and the Americans provoking North Korea.
Yeah, I think. I mean, North Korea is a very backward country and almost, at breaking point financially. Really, they've had sanctions on them for years. And James, the North Koreans in response have been doing nuclear tests. They've been moving missiles to the east coast. So presumably they can. The Yanks are talking about the missiles reaching Seattle or Hawaii or Guam.
Well, what wasn't David Cameron saying that North Korean missiles might land in Britain?
Yes.
Which seems to be awfully reminiscent of Tony
Awfully
Blair and his Iraqi missiles. I could hardly believe that when I saw it in the British media.
I know. I think the whole country's laughing at that, really. I don't think anybody's really taking that seriously. Which just shows to show how far the British public have come, really. They do all see through that and laugh at it.
I wonder if you're right. A lot of people do see Cameron as a rather spoilt sort of buffoon, but other people see him as the Prime Minister who speaks with authority, I guess.
Yeah, but all this, it's a lot of it's propaganda, and Steve Pachenik has been reporting from the demilitarized zone.
And he's a US analyst who's worked at the top level in Washington.
Yeah, he's been security advisor for many
And
administrations.
what's his take on this?
Well, he's saying he's there. He's in Seoul. Seoul is only 30 miles away from the demilitarized zone, so he's in a good position there. And he's saying that Seoul aren't even really taking this seriously at all. South Koreans aren't taking this seriously. They're not panicked. They're not threatened.
And then something about American arms companies or something.
Well, I mean, now we go into why are the Americans building up this propaganda? And again, we have the good old reason of the military-industrial complex, Boeing's. America's now forcing weapons onto South Korea, forcing them to buy.
It's a sort of shakedown on South Korea in a way.
Of course, it's a shakedown.
Extraordinary. Well, thanks very much, Roy.
Okay, thanks very much.
Ground the drones. That's what some people are saying. That's what Veterans for Peace are saying. They held a public meeting at Friend's house in London recently, at which WikiLeaks editor Julian Assange, who's being held in the Ecuadorian embassy pending arrest by the British, he participated via electronic link. They have a new campaign to ground the drones. Our reporter Noel Glynn attended this conference. So Noel, what have you got to tell us? What is the issue about using drones?
Well,
isn't drone use a good way to protect the lives of our patriotic military personnel?
Well, the problem is that it's also a good way of breaking international law and reinforcing Britain's reputation as a war criminal. British troops using drones are murdering civilians from a safe distance, and it's a war crime. It's a war crime to kill civilians, and we should not be doing it. The weapon is the Reaper MQ-9 unmanned aerial vehicle, manufactured by General Atomics, who have offices in London.
Don't we need these weapons to kill terrorists who these days threaten life and limb or everywhere? Supposedly?
Well, the Grim Reaper, as it is appropriately nicknamed, has been used widely in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Yemen and Somalia. People are targeted without being identified and are killed from above with no warning. Numerous civilians have therefore been killed in this way. Mosques, funerals, schools and meetings of elders have been attacked with drones. Killing of civilians, including women and children, is casually dismissed by the military as collateral damage, a euphemism used to disguise the way that we talk about murder.
But isn't it normal in warfare for a few civilians to be killed? Just the normal tragic consequences of modern warfare? We can't return to the era of the bow and arrow, surely, just because we're a bit squeamish. I mean, that's what they say, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's all being justified by government on the spurious grounds that the 9/11 attacks have made it clear that a new era of global warfare against allegedly fanatical Muslims is essential to preserve Western democracy and human rights. But there is no evidence that any of the countries where our troops are killing civilians had any involvement with the 9/11 attacks. They just happen to be predominantly Muslims.
And there are no non-Muslim countries being subjected to drone attacks at the moment.
I don't think so. No.
Yeah. So it's if Muslims to say this is a sort of religious war based on murderous racist attitudes, they might get a bit of support from their fellow victims.
I would think so. Yes.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Noel. The Fukushima disaster. It's not over. It won't be over for a long time, a very long time. It's the Fukushima disaster. 3 nuclear meltdowns, denied at first by industry, supplied experts on the media. Are they any nearer to telling us the truth now? Jimmy Walter has been following the worst nuclear disaster. Jimmy, what do you reckon?
Well, thanks, Ian, for having me here today on RAD TV and listening to my report. Well, the problem is that the government and TECO are both working in concert to hide the truth. Both the government and NISA, the Japanese Nuclear Agency, and TEPCO knew for 2 years that the plant would not withstand a 33-foot tsunami and did nothing, putting profit ahead of safety for the citizens of Japan and the world.
So basically we've got TEPCO, the Japanese company that owned the nuclear reactor. They don't seem to care much. And we've got NISA, the Japanese regulatory agency. We've got the IAEA, and those are the guys who are going around telling us that Iran's a threat, a nuclear threat at the moment. But they didn't seem to have noticed Fukushima, so maybe they're looking in the wrong places for their nuclear threats. And then we've got this Japanese ambassador has been saying something about this as well.
Well, I want to add one thing.
Okay.
Also, the Japanese media, NHK, has been parroting the government and TEPCO's line, not digging at all, and what is clearly in reports showing that this is a disaster waiting to happen.
Waiting to happen. There's more to come, possibly.
It's already bad. But we're talking about a worldwide disaster. We're talking about having to evacuate Tokyo. We're talking about millions of deaths if Unit 4 is where all the spent and hottest radioactive material is stored, were to catch on fire, it could not be put out. If you threw water on it, it would get even worse. All of it, Ian, all of it would burn and go into the atmosphere, and we're talking about more cesium than was ever released by all of the above-ground atomic testing ever.
Extraordinary. So we've had our 3 meltdowns, but that's not the end of it necessarily at all. Another earthquake, or we've got the highly unstable...
Well, it's worse than that. 3 weeks ago, less than 3 weeks ago, they had a total power failure at the same plant. The cooling system stopped. It was caused by a single rat chewing through a single cable. These systems are supposed to be such that they're redundant. If one system fails, another one's there to kick in. But a single rat chewed through a single cable and the whole thing stopped. They were just lucky it didn't stop for longer. And then, 3 days ago, it happened again. The power was shut down. Now, they haven't told us what's happened for that one, but whatever it is, twice inside of 3 weeks, we came in danger of that cesium pile catching on fire, making Tokyo uninhabitable, and causing millions of deaths worldwide.
So what's their answer to this? I mean, are they just in sheer total censorship and denial? I mean, it makes you wonder what's... It sounds like the last days of Hitler when he thought he had armies all over Eastern Europe didn't exist. I mean, we don't expect that sort of denial of reality to be operating in the modern world. I mean, what are they going to say?
The denial is in the industrial base of Japan. Just last week, they said, oh, we can't shut down the nuclear plants because we can't afford or get the fuel from abroad. Right now, Japan has very little, if any, coal, gas, and oil. They have to import it all. Nuclear was their way to keep their balance of payments going in what they think is a positive way. Actually, the Japanese are a bit smarter about it. So what they want is to keep industrial Japan exporting, a net exporter.
So it's the pressure of money, really.
It's
money
the
talks.
pressure of industry and money to hide the truth. If they were to admit the problem, it would increase the teeth, the momentum behind the non-nuclear movement, and so they're hiding as much as they can.
Extraordinary. And meanwhile, we're an earthquake away from a really, really, really serious problem.
We're a rat away from a very serious problem. I mean, a rat stopped the cooling system. What if it had burned out something else when it stopped the system?
And the risk lies not in the normal nuclear cores, which have already melted down in several of the reactors there, but this massive amount of spent fuel rods, which they're just storing there. You'd think they could store them somewhere a bit safer.
Well, they could have, but it would have been more expensive.
And now they can't get them out.
Right now, okay, I don't know what can and can't be done exactly, but not economically so far have they been able to get them out. But they should have been trying to get these things out of there and separated out and other fuel pools and at other locations so that one earthquake in one place doesn't destroy them all.
Thanks very much, Jimmy. It's a frightening prospect.
Thank you. And folks, if you know any Japanese or you know the government, please call them. Please try to stop this because this will affect the entire world.
And finally, here's a couple of good news stories taken from the newspaper Positive News. It only comes out every 3 months, but I'm sure there's even more positive news than 3 months worth. It's a great paper. And here's the story. Mayor of Bristol supports his city by taking salary in local currency. According to this story, he's taking his mayoral salary in Bristol pounds, which are issued in Bristol, circulate in Bristol, and are beyond the control of the IMF, the global financial system. 500 businesses in Bristol are using Bristol pounds, will accept Bristol pounds now. The scheme operates online banking and a text message payment system, so there's nothing old-fashioned about it. And secondly, from Positive News, plastic bottles could bring renewable lighting to all. You might have heard of light tunnels where people, yuppies, you know, spend a lot of money to have a hole cut in their roof and bring the light into the room. Maybe you haven't heard of that, but they do it now. Well, in the third world, they're doing it with simple plastic bottles and cutting a hole in their tin roofs. Because believe it or not, quite often in the third world, it can be very bright outside, but very dark inside because nobody can afford windows in slums. And somebody's had the very bright idea of cut a simple hole in the roof, stick a litre water bottle, an empty litre water bottle, and that will bring in the sunlight, and it's equivalent, according to Positive News, to a 45-watt bulb, which might not sound that good, but it's a lot better than more or less darkness when you're living in a slum in the third world. 350,000 solar bottles have been installed around the world. The idea is spreading like wildfire. Nobody's making fortunes out of it. It's just an idea spread by people on the internet, talking to each other. A great bit of good news. Thank you and good night.